This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com. Today I have a returning guest, number one author, number one best-selling author on Amazon for Not From Here Volume 5, Preston Dennett. What's it like to have a number one bestseller on Amazon?
It's thrilling. Not something I really ever expected I'd be doing. So, yeah, I'm sure having fun with it. And just watching it climb right up the charts real quick was mind blowing, really. So, yeah, number one book. It stayed there for a couple of days and now it's bouncing around in the top 10 and 20. So, I couldn't be happier about it. It's awesome.
I think maybe the cover might have something to do with it because it's a very cool cover. Can you explain who is on the cover exactly?
Yeah, that's exactly what I told my sister-in-law, who actually drew the cover for me. It was designed by my friend Dolly Saffron. It was her idea, really, because this is volume 5 of the Not From Here series. And each of the previous ones featured a different type of ET, grays, Nordics, praying mantis, a human-looking ET. I was kind of searching around for another type, and she's like, how about an Anunaki? So that's what that is. It's based on an actual, statue from, gosh, I don't know how far back, but thousands of years. So yeah, it's an Anunnaki, and I'm really happy with how it came out. And yeah, I'm really blessed to have my sister-in-law, Kisara, do the art. And I told her, yeah, it's because of you that this book is doing as well as it is. Because yeah, I think the cover is really striking.
Oh, 100%. And as far as the Anunnaki, I've heard other researchers talk about the Anunnakis. What are they exactly? I'm not very familiar with it.
Yeah, we have mostly historical accounts of it, so you don't hear a whole lot of really good firsthand information on it. Thankfully, I did interview a lady by the name of Dolly Saffron. She's the one who suggested I put in Anunnaki, and she did have the opportunity to meet one of them. They appear very much like that. She went through a bunch of different representations looking for one that was most accurate. So she really had a lot of input on it. And they're basically human looking, but very, very tall. And we're having open official contact with humanity quite some time ago, but they're still around. People do talk about contacting them, but it's not super common. She's the first case I ever had, really, of anyone who saw and quote Anunnaki.
Yeah, definitely very interesting. Now, one of the things you talk about in this book is UFO swarms, and we've seen a lot of videos come out lately of UFOs, particularly the pyramid-shaped ones, swarming Navy ships and so forth.
Right.
What's does this book cover as far as the swarms?
Well, back when I was investigating a wave of sightings over Topanga Canyon, this was in 1992, on June 14th in particular, there was a huge wave of sightings. I mean, the skies opened up, and eventually I got about 30 separate independent reports from different groups of people throughout this one small area, Topanga Canyon, located in Southern California, right outside of LA, of people who saw UFOs. Now, most saw one or two chasing them down the street. Some saw 4 or 5. One guy I talked to saw a very large craft with about 20 or 30 coming out of them. But there was one couple I interviewed. I call them Daniel and Catherine. They don't want their names to be used. They live on a very high ridge. And they were outside early in the evening and watched activity going on for most of the night. And they saw initially about 10, 15 objects coming up from behind a ridge towards the ocean. And when it happened the second and third time, they started counting it. And eventually, after a period of about 2 hours, they counted almost 200 objects. It's funny, when she told me that, I went up there and interviewed him face to face. The husband kind of groaned and said, I don't know if it was that many. I think maybe it was closer to 100. I burst out laughing when he said that, because 100 or 200, either way, I mean, that's phenomenal. But he admitted, no, his wife was probably right because she was the one who was counting them. And that was my first case like that. I would later get another, and it really got me wondering because I hadn't heard about a lot of cases like this. There was a few that came to mind, but I scoured the literature looking for them, and they're extremely rare. Probably the most famous occurred in Farmington, New Mexico. And that was an astonishing event. I think this was 1957, thereabout. And on the morning, gosh, I've forgotten the exact day. I'll have to pull that up in just a second here. But people were running out into the streets. I mean, businesses stopped, cars stopped on the street, people were running out of their homes because there was not 100, but like 200, 300 of these craft darting around. Some very high up, some quite low, saucer-shaped, metallic, doing all kinds of incredible maneuvers, coming at each other and pulling apart, circling around, turning at right angles. And it went on for a good 2 hours. Farmington is just a little town in New Mexico of about 3,000 people in the city center, but close to 6,000 people in the outlying areas. And they estimate that at least half of the people there saw it. I'm thinking probably more because most people don't want to talk about it. But you could not ignore this. There were so many people who saw this that it was absolutely undeniable. But yeah.
What do you think the purpose of these swarms? Because some people are saying this is their way of just kind of showing their power, or kind of displaying like what they can do if they want, or is it just more random than that?
No, well, the word you said it. The key word I think is display. Because that's we don't know for sure. Obviously, we can only speculate unless we talk to them. But I think it's very clear that they wanted to be seen, and coming down in those large numbers like that, it's undeniable that this was some sort of display. And just based on my years of research, it's pretty clear to me that there is an agenda to let the world know, let all humanity know that we are not alone, that we are being visited. And I think they're conducting what amounts to a publicity campaign. And cases like these are a really good example of that because it's so undeniable. They had to know that people would be out there and seeing this. So yeah, I think ultimately that's probably what it was. There's some speculation that this was, this occurred on St. Patrick's Day, if I remember correctly. And what I find so interesting about this particular case is, according to some sources, this is on the anniversary of the Aztec UFO crash, which was not far away. And some people say the crash occurred on the same day and that this was just sort of a commemoration or a reminder of that. That's, again, pure speculation, but I found it intriguing because there's really no other case quite like what happened in Farmington on that day. I mean, it was absolutely the biggest UFO event of its kind anywhere ever.
Did anyone manage to get a picture of it at that point?
Actually, yeah, they sure did. And I'm so glad because people always say, well, how come there's no photographs? And there is. It's a pretty famous photograph. It's quite old. I'm not sure it would convince a skeptic. This was back in 1950, actually March 17, 1950. But I've seen the photograph. You can look it up online. I didn't include it in the book. I don't have the rights to it, but it's not hard to find. If you just type in, Farmington UFOs, it shows multiple of disc-shaped objects, which are quite dark, and doesn't really have any reference points in terms of seeing buildings and the landscape around it. But it's interesting nevertheless. And when you combine that or add it to all the eyewitness testimonies, I think it's undeniable. It's funny because the Air Force really tried hard to debunk this. They said they were not aware of it. They're not investigating it. Ultimately, there was so much pressure, I guess, from people of the town. they had to comment on it. And all the comments were negative. We know nothing about it. There's nothing to it. Finally, they put out a sort of debunking explanation that this might have been a skyhook weather balloon, which had shattered into a million little pieces, and these fragments fell down, which is definitely a debunking, absurd explanation. Because if that were true, the town would have been covered in these fragments, and there wasn't one, not one example of that. And all the witnesses, pretty much all of them, said no, these were saucer-shaped craft. They moved in a controlled manner. I mean, there was one very large craft which was apparently releasing smaller ones. And there was a metallic sheen to them. Some were coming quite low. And it wasn't just one display. This actually took place 2 times on that same day. Just, I guess, to make sure that people were aware of it. But yeah,
is this the picture? Would that?
Yeah,
would that,
yeah,
yeah.
that's
Yeah,
it.
so I can see, 1950, that would be about as good as you could get. Definitely shows multiple different objects varying in size.
Yeah,
And
you
it
can
looks
see
like it was news. It looks like it was front page news at the time, too, from what I'm
oh, it
reading.
sure was. National news. I'm not sure if it went international, but it was a huge story. And a lot of people got really angry at how our military, our Air Force, our governments were handling this. Back then, the cover-up had been firmly clamped down due to cases like Roswell. So they knew at this point, for sure, that this was a real phenomenon. But they were doing everything they could, every technique they had to discount it. I mean, they went to the town and actually threatened some witnesses, told them not to talk about it, that you didn't see anything. I talked to a gentleman who's actually writing a full-length book about it. He contacted me hoping to get some new information. I sent him all the newspaper articles I had on this case and the information I could find, because it's a landmark case for sure.
Obviously, the most recent one like that would be the Phoenix Lights, which I think was around 96 or 97. Do you think we're almost due for another one of those, but in this era where everybody has cell phone cameras, in many cases HD now, where it would really be undeniable?
I sure hope so. That would be amazing. A lot of contactees have gotten the message or been told or have dreams about the sky filling with craft. So I think at some point that will happen. Right now, I'm not so sure. A lot of what's flying around is reverse engineered craft, and it's really confusing the issue and muddying the waters. But it seems like there's regular appearances of these huge waves of activity. Because if you look through history, the Phoenix Lights was a good example. While it was mostly just 1 or 2 craft, there's example after example of UFOs coming down over major city centers. In France, for example, in 1954, through, October and November, they were swarmed by UFOs in very large numbers over a 2-month period, with at least 100 cases of landings. And that's just the landings. There was probably about 1,000 or more sightings. I think that they do these waves, and there's a lot of them. Gulf Breeze, Hudson Valley, the Topanga Canyon wave is a good example. There was a wave in Wytheville, Virginia in the 1990s. Belgium had a wave. I think every country, or most certainly, have had an example of this. And it seems like they come every couple of years, every 5 or 10 years or so. And I think we are overdue, but we'll see. I mean, it would be a good time, certainly now, because people would be able to capture, I think, incontrovertible evidence. Though we already have it. I will say there was a sighting over Mexico City in 1991, July of 1991, during the solar eclipse, where a saucer hung over Mexico City for over an hour and was videotaped in 30 separate locations. It's hard to find the video now. It's been pretty much getting pulled off the web as fast as it's put on. And that was a remarkable, undeniable event. Another was the Kumburgaz Turkey footage, which is quite recent, 2007, 8, and 9, I think, over Turkey, which perhaps wasn't super widely viewed, but was filmed. And no one's ever been able to, in my opinion, effectively debunk it. And if you look at that footage and you study it, it's remarkable because you can actually see the little ET guys in the craft. So there's no doubt in my mind, certainly, that ETs do have a publicity campaign and are doing their best to disclose, because our governments won't. We're not even getting disclosure to this day, despite all these recent steps towards it. It's all talk. There's no real action. They're not showing us Roswell. They're not showing us the good footage we know they have. I mean, throughout the 1950s, they were sending up jets to chase these objects and had excellent gun camera footage. And we haven't seen any of that. So disclosure is still a long way away.
Is this the solar eclipse UFO from Mexico?
Yeah, it looks like it. I can't say for sure,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, apparently it was on Unsolved Mysteries.
Yeah, what an amazing event. I talked to a firsthand witness of it. He's like, oh yeah, it electrified the whole city. We all knew it. I think that's why Mexico has been a little bit more forthcoming than a lot of other countries out there, because to not talk about it would make them not credible, which is where our own government is at right now. They're at a point where people just don't believe them anymore. The lies have just stacked up to a point where they've become almost irrelevant with this subject.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflicting information. Is this the Turkey one?
No, the
Okay. That looks
Kumburgaz.
really weird.
Yeah, it's if you type in Kumburgaz, Turkey, Kumburgaz, it should pull it right up. And there's been some efforts to debunk this. And this just makes me laugh when I hear it, as a cruise ship that's kind of partly hidden or reflecting or doing inversion layer in the clouds. But this one took place over 3 years. Dr. Roger Lear was present during one of these filmings, which took place over a couple of hours. And the guy had a pretty good camera. That's it. Yeah. And
Yeah, so you can see the two little figures in there.
yeah, and these are not just still photographs. This is moving footage. And it's really quite astonishing how amazing, because there's almost no footage out there that we can really trust of actual ETs. There's a couple here and there, but this is one that I think is absolutely undeniable. I stand by it. Yeah, I've got a lot more to say about that footage, actually.
What else do you have to say about it? I mean, it might be for a future book, but
Yeah, well, I interviewed a contactee by the name of Dolly Saffron, and she was taught how to pilot these craft. I wrote a book about her experiences called Symmetry. And the ETs taught her how to pilot the craft, which may sound unusual, certainly to a skeptic. But I will say I've got several other cases of that. Grant Cameron put out a book called Sky Pilots, where he interviewed some 30 people or more who've had this experience. And she was actually on board that craft when it was being filmed. And she says flat out, yes, this was an attempt to announce the ET's presence. So, yeah, I'm going to put out another book on her case. So I'm not sure what to call it at this point, but it's going to be Symmetry Part 2. And I'm hoping to talk a little bit about that in there, because I don't think we were quite ready to reveal that in the first book. But yeah, I mean, she was there. She was a part of it.
someone's asking if you've ever been to Area 51. Obviously, you've never been there, but maybe you've been in the general area of it. And would there even be anything in Area 51 anymore now that it's kind of a known area and it's not no secret anymore, really?
Yeah, it's kind of an open conspiracy. I'm sure there's still stuff there because you cannot approach it. They will still whip out those guns and point them at you and lethal force is allowed to be used. There's signs all over the place. I have been there at least 3 times, possibly 4. It's a long drive out there north of Las Vegas. It's funny because I had 3/4 of a tank of gas in my little economy car. And by the time I got there, I'm so glad there was a gas station because I almost ran out of gas. It's huge. I don't know if people realize it, but 88% of Nevada is government owned. And Area 51 is massive. It would take you days and days and days to drive around it. And I went to the little alien, Rachel, Nevada. I did a convention there, did some speaking, and visited there a few times. A lot of sightings in that area for sure. I've talked to people who were on the edge there and saw craft coming in and out of Area 51. Most likely reverse engineered government craft, certainly. But what an interesting place. I mean, Nevada, the tourist commission actually renamed that highway the extraterrestrial highway. So it's put Nevada on the map in terms of this subject. And something's going on there, but I don't think it's that unique. If you look into the history of our Air Force bases and our military bases across the country, a good large number of them have a history of encounters. It's a lot more than most people realize. I would point people to the book, The UFO Cover-Up by Lawrence Fawcett and Barry Greenwood. They were the first to really point out, like, all our air bases are being visited. I did a video on just the California air bases, and most of them have been visited, whether it's Edwards or Hamilton Field or George Air Force Base or Port Hueneme or Seal Beach. They're all being visited.
You mentioned that you did a UFO conference near Area 51. One of the things you cover in this book is that ETs supposedly actually come to these UFO conferences. I've never heard of this before, but could you explain that?
Yeah, well, this kind of caught my eye when a gentleman wrote a book where he said he saw blue beings at a conference. And I kind of put that on the back burner, but there are quite a few witnesses who were there who say, oh, yeah, we saw it. I talked to one of them. She saw what everyone's talking about. And she's like, well, you know, they did look unusual. I'm not sure I would call them ETs. But according to one of the witnesses, he is absolutely convinced, and he ended up writing a book about it. I thought, okay, well, that's a one-off. I'm not so sure this is real. But I was at a conference, the Triad Conference in 1994 on Coronado Island. This is in South San Diego. And on the night before the conference, 6 people in one hotel were pulled on board a craft. And I talked to 2 others in another hotel. I ended up writing a whole book on this case because one of the witnesses contacted me. Yvonne Smith is really the primary investigator of this case. She also wrote a book called Coronado about this. But it really caught my attention because, you know, Coronado Island's a very crowded place. It's filled with police. It's a tourist trap. It's partly Navy owned. This is where the Navy SEALs do their training. It's the least likely place you would think of for an encounter. It's very populated. But it happened right during this conference. So that I thought was unusual. And then a couple of years, well, good number of years later, I did another conference in Irvine, California, where I was speaking about USOs. And it turned out that, I think his name is Michael Knox, he was attending this conference. He was in the same hotel, and he was visited during this conference, healed actually of a torn Achilles tendon. He had a roommate at the time who also witnessed some of this activity, little Grays coming in. Turned out there was another person at the hotel who said she was pulled on board during this conference, and she saw some of the speakers, the presenters, on board the craft. It's funny because I was there. I was one of the speakers. I have no memory of that. So I wonder about it. But there was a third witness as well, someone who was outside the hotel at night who said that they saw a UFO hovering way up high over the hotel. So I started looking into cases like these, and I found a dozen of them. probably the most impressive to me was one of the Contact in the Desert meetings. Contact in the Desert is probably the granddaddy of all UFO conferences. And when it was
Yeah,
being
there's one
held,
coming up in May, right? At the end of May
right,
this year.
right, I spoke at one a couple of years ago. It was all kinds of fun. It was a lot bigger than I thought it would be. Huge. I mean, they actually ran out of hotel room for me, and I had to go into a neighboring hotel, which was fine. But yeah, I mean, we're talking several hundreds, if not, I think they said 2,000 people attend these. And there was one of them, which it was being held at Joshua Tree at the time, where UFOs showed up, and pretty much for a 2-hour period. I think there was a total count of some 20 or 30 objects, all in all. I mean, they would show up at one at a time or two, groups of 3 or 4, but they were seen by a large number of people. We're talking several hundred. They were videotaped. I've yet to find that videotape. They were photographed. People watched them through binoculars, through night vision goggles. I know some of the witnesses. I've got some, good dozen reports of people who saw what they described mostly as glowing objects, not so much metallic craft with portholes and this sort of thing, but ones that would stop, wink out, appear in another place, move in unconventional ways, different colors, green, blue, red. So clearly not balloons or helicopters or satellites or anything like this. It's another good example of a display. And it's really interesting to me because what better place? I mean, here all the contactees are gathering, anyone who's interested in this subject. It's a great, perfect, ideal, really, to make an appearance. Unfortunately, it hasn't generated any kind of widespread publicity, which I find curious, but there is a media blackout. There is a cover-up on this subject. I suspect it's happened a lot more than people realize. But I did find a couple of other cases where people claim to have seen actual ETs at a conference. I mean, back in the day when I first started doing research, I was attending a conference in Los Angeles, and a lady came up to me, a very tall lady, who says, "Can I ask you a question?" She said, "I had this weird experience where this man, she had sat down in a corridor just to relax. It's very crowded at these conferences, and she just wanted some peace and quiet. She's sitting there alone on a bench in this hallway when there was a huge flash of light, and she saw a man walk out of it. And he walked up to her and basically claimed that he was an ET, and he visits Earth periodically, and they had a very short conversation. She wasn't sure whether or not to take him seriously, and he walked off. He didn't look unusual. He was dressed a little bit unusual, but not a jumpsuit or anything. She couldn't really remember in a whole lot of detail, but she wanted to know if I heard anything like this, and I had to tell her, no, I haven't. Now I wonder, because I've been to a lot of conferences, and occasionally people will walk up to my table and they've got very strange, clear, gray, hypnotic eyes and just seem a little bit different than the other people there. And I don't want to read anything into it, but I remember that happened once at a little MUFON meeting in Santa Barbara, and my sister-in-law, Kisara, the artist, was with me, and he came up to me, said a few words, and went to her. And she talked to him briefly, and she turns to me and says, "Did you see that guy's eyes? I think he was an alien." I'm like, "Yeah, I did." So I don't know. ETs are seen in public places, a lot of examples of it. So it was kind of a fun chapter. I thought, let's explore this. This could be interesting. And it is.
And I'm sure you've heard of this too, but like aliens in bookstores having weird reactions to reading books about aliens. That's happened a lot. I've read over the years.
Yeah, there was a very famous case with Whitley Strieber at, I forget the name of the bookstore. It was in New York, where his editor, Bruce Lee, not the fighter, but an editor for Morrow Books, went to check out the display of Communion, Whitley Strieber's book, which had just come out. And he walked to the back of the store. It was not easy to find. When in comes this couple who looked really strange. They were quite short. And although it was a warm day, they had big, large sunglasses on, mittens, caps pulled over their face, scarves. I mean, pretty much all their skin was covered up. Walked right up to that display. He stepped back and watched them speed read the book in a way that he says was impossible. So he was curious because he could hear them saying, oh, this part's not right, or this part is correct. And he walked up to them and they glared at him. And he stumbled back and ran to his wife and said, let's get out of here. Those people are not human. She's like, what are you talking about? He said, let's just go. But yeah, he said their eyes were far, far too large. Their skin was very pale. And I know how this must sound, but there's a lot of cases like this of ETs being seen at gas stations, convenience stores, schools, train stations, restaurants, casinos. This is definitely something that does occur.
Yeah, I don't know how much you believe Charles Hall, his books about the tall Weiss, but he alleged that they used to like dressing up and going out in Las Vegas where they could blend in very well, considering the type of people that were in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I heard him speak once. He's actually very credible. His books, there's a series of them, Millennial Hospitality, are kind of couched as fiction, though he now claims that they're true. And I found his testimony pretty compelling, actually. I can't say for sure whether it's true or not, but I did talk to a first-hand witness who feels up and down that he saw ETs at a casino. He saw this very slender guy walking very awkwardly down the steps, and there's someone standing at the top with pale white skin, very large eyes, wispy white hair. And he thought to himself, what a freak. And this being turned around and looked right at him, gave him the chills. And he says, I can't tell you for sure, but this guy looked like he could read my mind. Misha Johnston, she's a Las Vegas-based researcher. She had a photograph snuck out of a casino by a casino security guard, which shows what look like little gray guys, not the typical with the huge heads and the bald eyes, but they look like they're wearing jumpsuits. They very pale skin, very short, and not oversized heads, but somewhat large bald heads. It's an intriguing photograph for sure. Misha Johnston. So there's quite a few examples. I looked it up in just casinos because there was another one at the Circus Casino where a guy had a full-on visitation in his hotel room. I mean, no doubt he had had a sighting earlier that day over at the casino, went into his hotel room and had a full-on encounter where ETs basically ran out of the bathroom. He ended up having missing time. So yeah, I think there's something to these cases.
Another thing you cover in this latest book is the CE5s that are happening now that I think Stephen Greer has popularized. A lot of people are doing them. Some people are saying beware of them because you don't know what type of ETs you're trying to contact. Have you participated in one of these, and how has your luck been if you have?
Oh, I sure have. Yeah. It's really interesting because very early on in my research, I got a case where a gentleman, a set director for NBC, his name is Arnie Weiler, was working with another gentleman, Rick Liebert, a special effects guy. And they set up these computerized lights on the lawn of the George Page Museum in Santa Monica, the La Brea Tar Pits. They were making this display that looked like a peacock's tail for the NBC logo. And they turned it on. These are colored lights in sort of a disc shape. And they said as soon as they turned it on, 3 UFOs came swooping down. I interviewed both of them. Rick Liebert says, oh yeah, this has happened a number of times. He told me of another case in San Diego where a UFO came down to apparently investigate a green argon laser that they had put on top of the tallest building then in San Diego, in beat with the rock music, Pink Floyd and such. So this is using lights to call down UFOs. And Stephen Greer, who, popularized this movement, he's certainly not the only one who's doing it. It's been going on a while. I found a number of cases that predate this. But he came to LA in 1994 or so and did a lecture on CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, where he's basically forming groups and explaining to people how to call down UFOs. And as he's giving his lecture, he cited those two cases. He's like, here's a case from Preston Dennett on how you can call down UFOs. I'm like, whoa. And it was really interesting because that night, he's like, we're going to go out and try this. And he was forming an LA group. So I'm a charter member of this LA group, the CE5 group there. And there was probably 100 people at that lecture or more. I would say about 30 or 40 of us went to a rural area outside of LA, not too far away from, a million people, really. I mean, you could see the city lights. And sure enough, I mean, we got there around 11:30, approaching midnight. It was a little walk out into this clear spot. Someone shouted out, "Look up, what's that?" And we all looked up, and darn it if there wasn't a UFO. I could not believe my eyes. It was kind of a blob of light, not a craft or anything, or didn't look like it, and it was pretty high up there. But it was big. I mean, we're talking about the size of a quarter or a half moon, and moving across the sky at the zenith. Not a balloon, not a helicopter or plane. I knew enough astronomy to know that what I wasn't seeing. And it disappeared right in front of our eyes. I mean, how does it do that? So that was amazing. And a much smaller group of about 10 or 20 of us went up the next night. We're all sitting around doing a meditation, and these weird strobing lights start coming down. I thought someone was shining a flashlight in my eyes because we had our eyes closed to meditate and try to call them down. But we all opened our eyes, and you could see these flashes of light. And that's how it started. We ended up having quite a few sightings of mostly anomalous lights. Over the next 4 or 5 years, we go out once every 2 or 3 months and stay out real late, like 3, 4 a.m. But one of our best was at that same location, actually. Nothing had happened. We were packing up. And this is often when they'll come down, is when we're packing up and leaving. And sure enough, we're walking down the trail, and I saw this huge light flash from the mountaintop. No one else saw it. I'm like, guys, I saw something. And so we stopped. We pulled out our lights, and we had these big, powerful flashlights, and we flashed at it. Darned if that thing didn't flash back. Now, this was on the ground, so I was kind of on the fence about what we were looking at, because it could have been a person, given that it was on this mountaintop. But I know that area really well. It's called Rocky Peak. It's very inaccessible. There's a fire break up there, but there shouldn't be anyone up there at that hour. And after we kind of had this conversation with lights, suddenly it flashed this enormous blood red prismatic light. And that's when I knew, I mean, there's no way anyone could have a light like that. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Just the power and the color and the vividness of it. That was a really interesting one, because we had this little conversation back and forth for a good 20 minutes. I'll never forget it. So yeah, I was kind of a charter member of the LA group, and we've had a number of sightings that way, some really unexplainable ones.
I've heard some people say you shouldn't shine lights at UFOs because sometimes they'll shine back and people will get radiation issues out of it. Do you think it just depends on the situation, or do you think there's nothing to that claim?
I wouldn't use those little laser pointer lights. Dolly Saffron, who I talked about earlier, she's been on board when people have done that. And no, it's not a good idea. It's blinding. It's illegal. People have gone to jail for shining them at jets. So I wouldn't use those. Ultimately, I think meditation is the real key to doing this. Lights might facilitate it. But yeah, I interviewed a contactee recently. His story is in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. And he really wanted me to put this warning in because he's learned, he's had a lot of contact from the ETs, and he's had some government interference as well, he thinks. And he says, you need to be careful when you're doing these CE5s, because you could call down not so much malevolent ETs, which I don't think are a problem or really even an issue, but malevolent government folks who might masquerade as ETs and pull off what we call a MILAB event, a MILAB type event, military abduction or contact, which are pretty much negative because our government is pushing a fear narrative and trying to scare people and trying to say that ETs are here to hurt us. I have no good evidence of that whatsoever. But yeah, if you're doing a CE5 and this craft comes down and starts doing nasty things, that's not ET. We need to be aware, especially now, because we've reached a point where I'm absolutely convinced we do have some really advanced technology, whether it's 5G or 6G or 7G or up, using holograms. And you've probably seen this in some Japanese billboards in various large cities where they can do holograms that look absolutely real, whether it's a whale flying out through the air or cars coming out or people or dinosaurs or what have you. They could pull off a fake UFO with no problem. And they have actual anti-grav technology. So this is a concern because this is pointing towards what is a huge buzz in the UFO community right now, a false flag, a fake ET invasion, which I think is a distinct possibility. There's a lot of talk about this. I'm very concerned about it. If ETs suddenly come and invade, you can bet and they start doing bad things. That's not ET. I think at some point ET might come and scoop people off Earth if there's what we would call an existential crisis, something that would threaten all life on Earth, a massive CME that wipes out our electrical grid. This is one of the warnings a lot of contactees have gotten, or a mini nova, basically from our sun, or the Earth tipping on its axis. All these kinds of things are a distinct possibility. If you do your research into the science of this, don't believe me, look into it for yourself. I absolutely think that is a possibility because so many contactees are getting this message.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about in your book is the messages that these ETs pass along to contactees. And from all the research I've done too, it always seems to be about the environment or warning against wars and so forth. It never really seems to be a threatening one from them. What have you noticed through your research?
Exactly. I have to kind of shake my head in wonder when people talk about an ET threat, because if you get a message from ETs beyond, don't be afraid, you're fine, we're not here to hurt you, no harm will come to you, it's warnings, predictions, messages of some kind that are actually clearly for our benefit. We're very, very concerned about our use of nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear materials in any capacity. And we can see a lot of evidence of this. It's hard to find a nuclear power station or a missile site or any nuclear powered craft that hasn't been visited in some way. And when people are taken on board, that's what they're usually told, given warnings basically about our use of nuclear materials, and are told very specifically that when we explode these nuclear bombs, it's tearing holes into other dimensions and affecting a lot of people in ways that we are not even aware of. And it goes far, far beyond that. They have all kinds of warnings. They warn over and over again about war and aggression, greed and corruption, pollution, the destruction of the environment, all of these things, all the huge mistakes we're making, they're warning us about over and over again. And they're not, there was a very famous case in Malmstrom in 1967, which if you've been in the UFO community for any length of time, you know that they came down and basically shut down, pretty much all the nuclear-tipped missiles at the Malmstrom Air Base. And they didn't destroy them, they didn't permanently damage them, they just shut them down. This was a clear message. And I mean, they could have taken them away if they wanted. They didn't do that. So they're not coming down and intervening in a way that they're taking over or anything, but they're sending a very powerful and clear message over and over again. And I looked into these cases because I kept getting so many requests from people like, please do some research on this. And it's a monumental task. I probably at some point may write a book about it. But given that time is of the essence, I really wanted to just at least get started. And I put that chapter in this book. I think it's the most important chapter, and it's definitely the longest one, because there's not a researcher out there who has worked directly with contactees. There's people looking into all aspects of UFOs, whether it's sightings or the propulsion or landing traces or physiological effects. But those who work directly with people who have contact, are taking on board, have multiple cases of people being warned about us facing an existential crisis. There's a number of people who've been told that, yeah, at some point our Earth is in danger of tilting on its axis. People are shown, mudslides and hurricanes and tornadoes, and said this will happen. For example, real quick, Kevin Cameron, a Navy medic I interviewed, was pulled on board. It was a very benevolent encounter, although it did quite frighten him. They didn't even examine him. They just talked to him. He had a long conversation with these very tall praying mantis beings. And he asked them all kinds of stuff, what they eat, where they're from, and so forth. And they told him basically, since we started exploding nuclear bombs and weapons, it started what they called a countdown clock, and that all these events will occur and you cannot stop them. And they showed him a 3D, he says it looked like he was looking out the window. It looked completely real, but they showed him future events, several of which did happen, he says, of mostly hurricanes. It was a lot of hurricanes, but tidal waves, earthquakes, mudslides, tornadoes, droughts, all kinds of climatic and weather events that they said will happen. So this is not at all unique. Over and over again, people get this same darn thing. And there's different theories for this. Some people say, oh, well, these are just the ETs testing our emotional reaction to tragic events. This is what a number of researchers have posited. And some have said, well, these are just scare tactics because sometimes these predictions don't come true. But I have to tell you, having interviewed a lot of people and really scoured the literature on this, most people who experience this, and they're the ones who would know because it's their experience, they feel these are valid predictions, valid warnings of true events. And just breaking it down, looking at what's actually happening on our planet, we're seeing it right now. So I think it really behooves us to take all of these warnings and predictions very seriously, deadly serious, because this is exactly what's happening right now. We're facing, huge events of droughts and anomalous weather and hurricanes and tornadoes like we've never seen before. We're breaking records every day. Well, not every day, but you know what I mean, a lot. So, yeah, I'm very concerned about it. We need to take these warnings seriously.
Have you heard that nuclear bombs being set off in the past have potentially interfered with the propulsion systems of UFOs and caused some crashes as well?
Not specifically. I know there was some speculation about the Roswell crashing because radar was interfering with their navigation system. And that has come up in a few contactee accounts. But as far as I know, I don't have enough firsthand information to directly tie UFO crashes to that. I have looked into UFO crashes. That's not my area of expertise by any means. But I wrote UFOs over California, and then New York and Nevada and Colorado and New Mexico and other states. Every one of them have UFO crashes. People are always telling me, well, if they're so advanced, why would they crash? I think we need to take a couple of things into account here. One is that UFO activity has been far more numerous than people realize. If UFO centers like MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, National UFO Reporting Center, get 10, 20 reports per day. Well, we can times that easily by 10 or really 100, because 1 in 100 people will report their sighting, their encounter to MUFON or NUFORC. Most have no idea about these reporting centers. So my point is, UFO activity is a lot more common than people realize. And with that many craft flying around, it's no wonder there's an accident here or there, because accidents happen. But talking to contactees, I think the real reason is honestly, these craft basically fly by harnessing the magnetic field lines of our planet, the gravitational field lines, which are very unpredictable, very changeable, not super constant. And especially now with all these solar flares, we're at solar maximum right now. I would really encourage people to look into the behavior of our sun. Look at the research of Ben Hansen. He's really the go-to guy with this. He has a website, I think it's called Suspicious Observers. But there's a lot of good science on this, and it's wreaking havoc. We have grid failures all the time due to these massive solar flares. And this is what's making it very difficult for these UFOs to fly around. Dolly Saffron, who I keep referencing because she's my go-to gal with this, she's had so much contact. She says this is a big problem. And this is why ETs have basically bugged out right now. And activity has dropped dramatically because they said that's enough. The magnetic fields of Earth are far too unstable right now. It's not safe to fly. So that, I think, is probably what's causing a good number of these crashes over the past, well, since 1930s onward. Even before that, I mean, the Aurora crash in Texas, I think it was 60 or something. But yeah, there's a long, long history of these, and UFO crashes are far more common than people realize. It does happen.
Yeah, weren't they calling it an airship still back when that Texas crash happened?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, one interesting thing about your book is you discuss like animals and pets being abducted too, which you don't hear about too often. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started to get interested in that because every now and then I would hear stories about persons, mostly dogs. I did try to find some cases on cats and found just a few, but a number of people are taken on board with their pet. There was a little kid from Russia. His name was Rado, and it's not a super well-known case, but he was observed coming down by his brothers and sisters out of the sky and floated into his room with his 2 dogs. And he says the ETs came and got him, and he says, is it okay if I take my dogs with me? And they said yes. And that was kind of the first case I heard about that. And I thought it was rare. I thought it was a one-off again. But as time went on, I started to hear more cases like these, where people are taken on board with their dog, or where ETs are trying to take someone's dog on board. And there's quite a few cases like this. Probably my favorite is this guy from Louisiana who was out there hunting in the bayou with his dog Hunterbone when a UFO showed up, and his dog went running towards it, barking, and next thing he knows, they're both on board. And it was a very benevolent contact. The ETs gave that typical warning they always do, and warned about wars and nuclear proliferation and this sort of thing. And he was looking around for his dog, and the dog had been paralyzed and was floating through the room like a stuffed animal. And the ETs apologized and said, well, we had to do this. Your dog was trying to bite us. But it was a kind of amusing case where someone was taken on board with their pet. And it's funny because when I was doing research on this, I asked Dolly Saffron, and she's like, oh yeah, they used to take me on board with my pets. I wasn't aware of that when I put the first book out. So that's another thing I want to explore with her about that, because there's quite a few cases. I found cases reaching all the way back. People's dogs will disappear for a while and come back shaking and scared. Other are pulled on board, and the ETs will ask them, do you mind if I examine your dog? A number of cases like that. So yeah, it's an interesting aspect which hasn't gotten really any attention, which is one of the reasons I wanted to explore it. That's what these books are all about, sort of taking a look at the darker corners or areas of UFO research that haven't gotten any attention.
And you talk about the paralyzing of the dog. You always hear that in some abduction cases, it's like one of those dreams that people have where like their body feels paralyzed and then they wake up and they can move. Is
Yeah.
that a common thing in abduction situations where people actually get that feeling like they can't move, but they're like conscious?
Yeah. I mean, there's a phenomenon called sleep paralysis, where people will wake up and they can't move and they have very dreamlike images. And skeptics have really worked hard to say that onboard experiences, I don't call them abductions so much because that offends a lot of the contactees who says, well, I wasn't abducted against my will. It was a voluntary experience. That's just an aside. But yeah, sleep paralysis is a phenomena that basically our brain releases a chemical which renders us unable to move, so we don't sleepwalk and act out our dreams. And it can be very disconcerting and confusing for people who have this. I've certainly had it when I've done meditation towards trying to achieve astral projection and out-of-body experiences, because basically you're working to wake up during the sleep state when you do that. So I'm very familiar with sleep paralysis, and it does not even come close, not even close to explaining onboard experiences, despite what debunkers and skeptics may say. Because people who are pulled on board are being healed of physical illness. They're being sometimes implanted. They are not in their rooms. People will come into the rooms and the person is not there. And if you go outside, there's often, well, not often, but certainly consistently, examples of landing traces. And by that, I would mean crushed grass or indentations in the ground or evidence of very high heat source, broken branches. And then there's, of course, a good number of multiple witness cases where 2 or more people are taken on board. So sleep paralysis doesn't come anywhere near explaining it. And it's ridiculous that this is still a thing that people are putting forth. And anyone who does the barest amount of minimal research can easily push that aside and say, no, sleep paralysis is a separate phenomena that has nothing to do with it. But it can be confusing because, yes, when someone does have an experience, sometimes they do experience this inability to move. It's usually quite brief during the initial stages of an encounter, or perhaps as they're being put back. Because once they're on board, and if they're not completely panicking, they're given freedom of movement. But if you're not, if you're in absolute state of fear and you're lashing out, that's dangerous for the ETs, and they will render you unable to move or restrict your movements in some ways. So that's not uncommon.
Another thing you talk about in your book, just to touch on briefly, is the phenomenon of twins being abducted or having contact. And I have heard of this. What is the connection there, do you think?
There's got to be a connection of some kind, because I kept getting twins. People I would interview and says, I'm a twin. Like, oh, really? And, twins are not super common in society. They're not like rare, but it seems like there's a high number, a disproportionately high number of twins in the contactee population. And there's some very well-known cases. The Kinsella twins from England. Raymond Fowler did a book on the Allagash case where people were taken on board. 2 of them were twins, Jim and John Wiener, I think that's his name. And yeah, I kept running into it. So I thought, I wonder if this is a thing. After I ran into it several times, I started taking a deeper dive into it. And I found some really interesting details. One is sort of what's called the missing fetus syndrome, or the vanishing twin, where a mother will be pregnant with twins and then one suddenly disappears. And often this happens to contactees. This is a well-known, well-documented medical phenomena where most doctors will say, well, basically the twin is absorbed and it happens very early in gestation, which absolutely is true. But there's a bunch of cases where pregnancy is well along and the twins are well documented and one is gone. It's just not there. And now this is a question I always ask, because I've had a number of people tell me, well, I wish I had told you this, but yeah, I was a twin, but my twin disappeared. Over and over again, this keeps coming up. So it appears there's some really unusual cases of this kind. I mean, one guy was pulled on board and he met his twin on board a craft. This happened to Dolly Saffron as well. So I took a deeper look in this, and I didn't find quite as many cases as I thought I would. I sure found a lot, though. And we do know that ETs have a very strong interest in genetics and upholding our own genetic lines and collecting genetic material from people. And they certainly seemed very interested in the Allagash case, and the identical twins involved in that particular case. And another detail that I found kind of interesting is when people describe seeing ETs, they're described as looking very much like twins themselves, particularly when people describe, I don't like the term Nordic, but human-looking ETs. Travis Walton talked about it. He saw human-looking ETs on board. He says, they looked like twins to me. They were both the male and female, very much could have been brothers or sisters or twins. I've got a number of cases of that. There was a gentleman who had a face-to-face encounter with sort of human-looking ETs, but they had darker skin, sort of Mesoamerican. He's Mexican, maybe Peruvian. But they were 5 feet tall, had short hair, male and female, all dressed in blue jumpsuits. He says they could have all been twins. And I kept hearing that, so I'm wondering if that's a connection here as well. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this, because this is another thing that no one's really looked into. And it's fascinating, because I think it might hold some really interesting insights into what's going on here.
Very interesting. And the last thing I'll ask you about, something else that you cover in this book, is do ETs have names? I mean, I have heard, particularly from guys like Charles Hall, that they have like rankings as far as very similar to our military. Have you heard about ranking systems as far as like the leadership goes? And also for names, is it like us where ETs will have individual names?
Well, as far as ranking, no, I haven't heard a lot about that. I will say that people who are taken on board do see ETs taking on certain roles, whether it's a pilot or a doctor or, everyone's got their job to do. But I don't see any evidence of ET kings or queens or governors or presidents or any federalized system or anything remotely like that. No money. I think that's basically us imposing our own cultural values, our own sociological perspectives onto ETs, who, as near as I can tell, are very much a cooperative and are very telepathic and just work very well together with different roles that they can step into at any time. But yeah, the name thing is really interesting, because there's a good number of cases where people have gotten names from ETs. It's certainly very common in the contactee era. But I mean, there's a case from Charles Higdon, I think is his name, where a hunter from Laramie, Wyoming, had a contact with an ET, was pulled on board. It was a tiny little craft, huge inside. He was hunting elk. He saw elk on board the UFO. It's apparently taken to their planet. A really interesting case. He was healed of tubercular scar in his lung. Carl Higdon, that's his name, and kidney stones. But the ET introduced himself and said his name was Also One, which is so unusual. And it reminded me of another case involving Woodrow Derenberger of Virginia, I think it was, who met an ET called Indrid Cold. I thought, are there other cases where people are given names? And certainly Betty Andreasen, very well-known contactee, her main liaison was a Gray who introduced himself as Quasga. And she worked with another guy who called himself Juhop. Really interesting names. A lot beginning with Q. There was another lady, Barbara Shute was I think her name. She said the ET she met was called Quasgaw, which is almost identical to what Betty Andreasen was told. And Barbara, drew the ET, and it's nearly identical to Betty's drawings. So I'm wondering if that might even be the same ET. But Bill Hamilton, another researcher, he was examined by a Gray who introduced himself as Quaylar. That really rang a bell with me because I just talked to a lady who met a Gray who was really kind of shocked at our medical system and how primitive it was, but called himself Quai. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting names. One lady, Jean Robinson, she met an ET who introduced himself as Quetzal. Now, if you know anything about South American history, the Quetzalcoatl was supposedly an Aztec god who came down and was part of this whole sky gods things where they come down and spread knowledge to the indigenous people there. And that was an interesting connection, to say the least, because it's almost undeniable that Quetzal is part of Quetzalcoatl. And some people are given very much Earth names by ETs, which might be a way of reducing the fear factor, but that's certainly come up. I talked to a lady who met a Gray ET who said his name was Kevin, of all things. But yeah, this is definitely a thing, and I think it's important because it hasn't gotten a lot of attention for some reason. Whitley Strieber did look into it and found some interesting parallels to Gaelic language with some of these ET names. But I think it shows a sort of human side to ETs and shows how they are, in many ways, very much like us. And I think, I could have written a whole book about it. It's kind of repetitive. What I'd really like to do is get a whole, like a baby name book, a name of all the ETs, and just list them down so we can take a look at it and do a real comparative and statistical analysis and see what we can learn from it. Because there are a lot of cases where ETs have provided names.
Very interesting. And for anyone that wants to know more, it's in your best-selling book, Not From Here, Volume 5. How many books have you put out at this point? Because you are just a machine at these ET books.
Yeah, I love doing it. That's number 32. 33 is coming soon. Already working on 34. Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun doing this. It's an important subject. I think you'll agree, anyone who gets involved. I mean, this subject has the potential to really change the way people think about their place in the universe, about ourselves. It's a core belief. This is very much like religion or politics or sex. It's something that people hold very dear and really kind of defines us as a species. So
yeah, it is very much like religion, I think, because when people make fun of it in some ways, when people are believers and have done the research into it, it's almost as offensive as if someone's insulting your religion, I find.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm so glad to see a lot more attention being paid to this subject over the past few years. That's, I think, the best thing that's come out of these, quote, steps towards disclosure. Is it's brought in a lot of people and brought in a lot of legitimacy, and we're enjoying a real honest-to-God resurgence of interest and popularity on this subject. So it's a good day for ufology. It's a good time.
And if people want to follow you to learn more about where your books come out and so forth, I know you're on Facebook. Where can they look you up?
Yeah, I've got a page on Facebook, an author page. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I've got a YouTube channel. My books are available on Amazon, of course, and other online retailers. I'm pretty easy to find, actually. website as well. Just punch my name in. And yeah, if you want to contact me, please do. I'm always interested in hearing from people, whether it's a comment or a question, or if they have a story to share especially. But yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Devin. I appreciate it.
Well, you're always full of knowledge and great insights with all the people that you talk to. I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to tell the fans. Best of luck with this book. I hope it hits the #1 again.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I would tell people, do your own research. Don't believe our lying governments. Don't think they're ever going to disclose, not willingly. Leave fear behind. Don't buy into the fear-based narratives that are out there. And yeah, be very careful to do your research, because this field is riddled with disinformation. That's what I would tell people. And have fun. That's why we're here.